"Where is your disabled son? Did he die?" Those words landed like a plate thrown against a wall. The reception area froze. Fluorescent lights, the antiseptic sting in the air, the soft tick of a clock above the nurse's station. People glanced up from magazines and phones. Ricardo, taller than I remembered, his face colder, his voice loud enough to make everyone turn, stood a few steps away with a look that tried to be casual and succeeded only in cruelty. For a moment I felt something old and familiar slide across my chest. The small animal of shame, the one that lived under the ribs in the years after Roberto's funeral. I kept my hands folded in my lap. My knuckles had the memory of work etched into them, years of scrubbing floors, of holding babies while their mothers answered phones, of making beds in hospital wards while thinking of how to keep our own roof from leaking. I was 60 now, my hair threaded with silver, and I'd learned to make stillness my armor. A young doctor, someone in scrubs and a tired smile, stepped forward from the doorway. He had a clipboard tucked under his arm and kindness in his voice when he asked, "Are you okay, Mom?" It was nothing I hadn't heard before, and everything I'd been waiting for. The question hung between us, like the prelude to a story I had lived so many times, people thought they knew its ending. Tonight, in that bright public place, it felt like a door had been forced open. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a long, slow recognition, the arc of a life that had started with loss and led, relentless and surprising, to a kind of justice stripped of triumphalism. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. I was 22 when Roberto died. We were young and simple in those ways that make grief heavier. No savings, mostly chipped dishes and a few pictures on the wall. He worked with his hands, repairing radios and small appliances in our neighborhood, and he loved me with a steady, quiet loyalty that made the simplest things sacred. The day of the accident, I remember how the sun looked through the curtains, ordinary and cruel. He left for work and he never came back. People say time heals, but the truth I learned is different. Time becomes a room you learn to move in without tripping over the things that used to break you. After a while the edges dull, but the space is still mapped by absence. When I found out I was pregnant, the world narrowed and unfurled all at once. The pregnancy was a small, bright secret in the middle of grief. I met Ricardo at a church benefit where I had gone to help serve coffee. He was polite, politer than most men I knew, handing out plates, flattering with the kind of words that made a widow feel seen. He spoke of steady jobs, of plans, of how a mother should not face the world alone. In the beginning, he was careful in ways that feel like rescue when you have been pushed to the edge. He courted me with attention. He promised a life different from the one I had been clinging to, a house with painted shutters, weekends at the beach, a steady income. When he asked me to marry him, I wanted a partner, someone to help hold the weight of being a single mother. I was tired of explaining where my savings were, of translating my grief into reasons to be considered less. Ricardo offered certainty. When you're young and grieving, certainty is a tempting garment. Marriage revealed the seams of him. The manners that felt like refuge at first began to tighten like straps. He complimented me only in the outline of what he wanted me to be. Clean, presentable, small in my requests. At first it was the little things. "You shouldn't wear that to my office," he'd say about a frayed blouse. Then the comments became about me as if I were an idea he had purchased. "You never understood ambition," he lectured once, while he sipped coffee and thumbed through a magazine. "You'd rather stay at home and wait for miracles." When Bernardo was born, the room smelled of disinfectant and sweet newborn skin. I had named him before I saw him, whispering the name like a prayer for protection. Those early hours are blurred, noisy, luminous, held together by nurses and monitors. A pediatrician came in quietly after the initial checks. He spoke gently, as he must to every parent, drawing breath where a harsher sentence could have been spoken. He said words that, in another mouth, might have meant possibility. "He has features consistent with Down syndrome." He called it trisomy 21, clinical and precise, the phrase sliding into the room like cold water. Ricardo's face changed the way a photograph fades on the sunny side after prolonged exposure. The smile drained, color shifted. I had not yet learned that his kindness was conditional, that his heart fit comfortably around people only when they reflected what he valued most about himself. When the doctor left the doorway, Ricardo whispered, not so much to me as to the room, "This is not what I signed up for." He stayed for a while, half mourning, half measured. He said the words he thought would shelter him from guilt. Then, when the nurses were busy and the corridor was empty, he stood up, zipped his jacket, and walked out. I remember the angle of his back as he left, upright, untroubled, the way he closed the door without turning. He did not come back that night. He did not return when the social worker called, nor when family tried to reason with him. His absence spoke in actions, missed appointments, unpaid bills, papers he signed and then pretended not to recall. The legal language of separation arrived slow and clinical, but the wound was immediate. And then, a night I still see like a bad weather map. Rain, the kind that falls as if someone is shaking a sheet of water over the city. Ricardo came that night with his suitcase and a finality that made me think of locked gates. He accused me of failing him, of bringing into his life a complication he could not stomach. The words he used in that small, hard voice were crueler than any physical blow. He said, "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." He pushed a box of clothes into my arms and slammed the door behind him. I stood in the doorway for a long time, soaked through, cradling a newborn who slept with all the trust of someone who didn't yet know the world's language. I remember the city lights blurred to a smear behind me and thinking, absurdly, that if I made one more step, the ground would part and swallow me whole. But the night teaches you things. How to carry a child under an umbrella and how to ask for a corner on a stranger's stoop. That night, with rain up to my knees, I found a bench under the arc of a bus shelter and waited for the morning. The days that followed were a slow, stubborn apprenticeship in survival. I had never been unemployed in ways that required repeated reinvention. I cleaned houses, scrubbed dishes in a hospital kitchen, sewed hems for neighbors who would never learn my name properly. I learned to stretch bread thin enough to make a child's eyes light up. Each job left me exhausted, but never empty of the resolve that a mother carries like a small stone in her pocket, something you can press against your palm and remember you are still whole. Dona Jandira was the first person who saw us without judgment. She owned the boarding house on the 4th floor above a bakery and kept a pot of coffee on at all hours. She had a way of looking at people that said, "You were not a project, you were a neighbor." When she let me and Bernardo stay in a small room for the price that fit our desperation, it felt like a narrow grace. Her kindness was practical. She showed me where to find day labor. She mended my son's tiny shirts, and she taught me how to bargain for milk without shame. Bernardo grew. He was a baby who laughed loud and often, who liked the rhythm of pots in the kitchen and the soft hum of the television. He fed me more than food. He fed my reason to keep pressing forward. But from the early weeks, there were things that doctors called delays, later to roll, later to speak, hands that had an odd rhythm. The pediatricians were careful, their voices measured. In clinics with bright posters and careful waiting rooms, they said words like support, therapy, early intervention. I learned new phrases, speech therapy, motor milestones, developmental screening. Yet even when charts suggested a slow climb, Bernardo surprised me in ways the forms did not capture. One morning when he was 2, a bright, stubborn child who loved lining up the wooden ducks in our living room, he sat with my old medical textbook. It was a heavy thing, a relic from the clinic where I had once cleaned and lingered. I had never imagined the book would be anything but a doorstop, but he turned the pages as if reading the pictures aloud. He pointed to an illustration of the brain and traced the folds with his finger, humming the way he hummed when he was happy. He repeated a word from the caption one time, then another. He began to name the parts after a week. Cortex, cerebellum. The way he said those syllables felt like a secret code, meant only for my ears. I started carrying a small notebook. I wrote down the little things, the times he surprised a therapist, the odd little jokes he invented at breakfast, the way he taught himself to thread beads with an attention that made my chest ache. The professionals nodded politely. Some children show areas of relative strength, they said, and I wrote that down too. But what they labeled as relative strength felt to me like a whole country of possibility. School was another battleground. Public schools in our city were a mix of well-intentioned rhetoric and quiet exclusion. I went to the principal's office more times than I can count, papers in hand, advocating for a place that would not be a single corridor of pity. Teachers were sympathetic on paper, but fearful in practice. How to include, how to assess, how to write a line on a report card that did not make the child's future seem like a sentence. There were meetings with psychologists, with the local education authority, with parents who whispered behind my back as if I carried a contagion. "He's brighter than he looks," I insisted at one meeting when Bernardo was 5. He sat curled in my lap, his fingers busy with a pencil, drawing a spiral that he would later replicate in precise geometry. The psychologist smiled, kind and careful. "We recommend a specialized plan," she said. "We also have to be realistic about expectations. To be realistic, I learned, was often to accept the low bar others set for you. Yet there were moments, small, stubborn resistances, where expectations cracked. At a community fair, where the city set up stalls and free tests, Bernardo completed a puzzle faster than children twice his age. He volunteered at a charity clinic we sometimes visited. He would run his small hands over toy stethoscopes and mimic the interns swapping rounds. Once, while I polished the counter and kept watch over the waiting room, he walked into a room full of senior volunteers, and without prompting, began to explain in his own halting sentences how he liked the parts of the heart. "The valve," he would say, "keeps blood from going the wrong way." The women in the room clapped as if for a performer. Later, one of them told me, "I don't know what he has, but he is sharp." A neuropsychological evaluation was suggested when he was 7. It felt scary, as if we were giving the world a reason to put him in a tidy box. The tests were long, puzzles, memory tasks, language exercises. He sat at a small table, pencil poised, and when a task asked him to remember a sequence of shapes, he did it without hesitation. The person administering the test tapped notes into a tablet and watched us both with the kind of curiosity that is neither kind nor cruel. It is simply clinical. When the results came back, the report read as if 2 different people had been assessed in the same body. There were scores that reflected the delay most thought they saw, and then there were scores that soared: verbal memory, pattern recognition, an ability to synthesize information that the examiners described in almost disbelieving terms. The term they used, dual exceptionality, sounded like a puzzle made of 2 opposite pieces that somehow fit. It meant my child was both identified with Down syndrome and also displayed areas of intellectual talent. People react to that kind of news in strange ways. Some smiled at me with the softness of those who have decided the world is full of miracles. Others were more measured, offering referrals and step-by-step plans, like a surgeon offering a map. I felt a mix of vindication and new fear. If he was gifted in some ways, what would the world do with that gift? Would it be forced into a template that made it less useful, or would someone, some teacher, some mentor, see the whole of him? We kept working. I cleaned more houses and took an extra shift at the bakery in the mornings. We traded in broken things for good things when we could, an old curtain for a used school bag, doorknobs for a second-hand set of encyclopedias that Bernardo loved. He devoured books like a child discovering sunlight. It didn't matter if the pages were dense with text. He would sit and track the letters and invent voices for the paragraphs. In the evenings, after the work and the tuition and the endless bracing for the next bill, he would stand at the window and recite facts from the books he'd clutched that day. Once, practicing anatomy, he named cranial nerves out loud, as if counting the keys to a kingdom. There were setbacks. Schools refused him. Funding for the therapies we needed was scarce. I learned how to write to bureaucrats with the blunt precision of someone who knows her plea must be both personal and unembellished. I learned to sit in waiting rooms until they called me, and to call again, and to walk into principals' offices with the stubborn steadiness of a woman who has been pushed out into a storm and refuses to be washed away. Neighbors watched our ascent with the private judgments people make when they are trying to fit complexity into a neat narrative. "She works too hard," some said. "She should ask for help," whispered others, as if the asking itself were a shame. But then small victories accumulated. A teacher who adjusted a curriculum just enough for Bernardo to shine. An internship at a small clinic where a sympathetic doctor let him observe. A scholarship to a summer program that fed the fire in his mind. One winter morning, when the city was raw with cold and the wind felt like a hand raking the face, Bernardo walked into the living room with a stack of photocopied articles tucked under his arm. He had been accepted into a supplemental education program downtown, one of those improbable doors that opens if you pound at it long enough. He looked older than his years and steadier than the world gave him credit for. "Mom," he said that night, setting the papers down on the tiny table, "I want to be a doctor." I remember the way the room went very quiet after he said it. The radio hummed in the background, the kettle forgot to whistle, time stretched as if to make room. For a second, I was back on the bus shelter bench, soaked to the bone, the night sky a black ledger of things I wanted to rewrite. I thought of Roberto, hands that could coax life back into a broken radio, and of all the hands that had pointed at our life as if it were a problem to be solved by other people's pity. Becoming a doctor in my neighborhood felt like wanting to climb the tallest building in a city where the elevators often broke down and most people never attempted the top floor. It was audacious. It was dangerous to hope. But there was something else, a quiet insistence that whoever you were, whether you came with labels or with a backstory, you could still ask for the room to try. So we began to plan in the only ways we knew how. He studied with a fervor that made my days blur, mornings at the clinic, afternoons with tutors, nights in libraries that smelled of dust and possibility. I worked more hours, skipping social calls, trading sleep for tuition checks. I sold things I loved and never spoke of again. I learned to be precise about money, how to take one small bill and make it mean 2 meals, 1 bus pass, 1 photocopy. Along the way, there were people who thought their pity would help. There were others who, without drama, opened a door. A professor from the supplemental program took note of Bernardo's papers and recommended him for an internship at a community hospital. The word recommended in his mouth was an invitation into another world. People who had professional lives and heavy titles sometimes looked at Bernardo and saw not a problem, but a person with an urge to learn. Each small door widened the hallway we walked down. By the time he was 16, the trajectory of his life no longer fit the boxes people had tried to shove him into. He won a modest scholarship. He passed entrance exams. He started undergraduate courses with a focus on pre-med. The neighborhood that had once thought of us as a cautionary tale began, slowly and awkwardly, to re-evaluate what they'd seen. But life does not let you arrive without reminders of the roads you came through. There were nights when I lay awake and heard Ricardo's voice in my head, not in the present, but like a recurring ghost from a book I had closed. I thought of that hospital lobby years ago, the door that shut on us in a storm, the man who had walked away. There were times I wondered if the past would ever choose to knock on our door again, and then Life has a way of aligning scenes in the most ordinary places. Invitations, coincidences, the way people cross paths. These things create a tapestry that is both tender and strange. It was years later, in a hospital not unlike the one where I had watched Bernardo first take a breath, where those threads began to pull taut. The city is full of hospitals. You can spend your life passing through them. You can grow used to the antiseptic smell and the way fluorescent lights make everyone look pale and honest. When the day came that Ricardo appeared in my life again, it was in a place I had come to know for other reasons. A child with a fever taken to the emergency room, a late-night visit to a clinic. He had aged into a man whose arrogance felt smaller when his body no longer obeyed him the way it used to. He looked at me across a corridor, and the same cruelty slid back into place. He asked the question, loud, public, designed to wound. The room took note. "Where is your disabled son? Did he die?" The words were the same. The life between them and us had stretched and become something else. This time, however, the air answered differently. A young doctor, steady, compassionate, leaned in close and asked, "Are you okay, Mom?" I let you feel that moment the way I did, small, sharp, a hinge. There was fear in me, yes, the old animal of shame. But there was also an unexpected steadiness that had been forged in years of late-night study sessions, in the small victories over prejudice, in the 1,000 acts of making ends meet and keeping hope alive. The presence of that doctor, who did not know he was standing in the middle of our history, felt like a first ripple in a tide that had been building quietly for decades. I didn't know then what else the hospital would hold. I did not know whether the person in scrubs would be connected to the man who had walked out years ago. I only knew that as I sat there, something inside me tightened into expectation. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine a scene where dignity replaced insult, where care replaced contempt. If this story is touching you in any way, if it is waking something in your chest, please hit like and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It helps me know these moments are not lived in a vacuum. After that night in the lobby, the past kept knocking in small ways. I was called to follow up appointments, asked to meet with social workers about Mr. Ricardo's case, and more than once I found myself standing in corridors I had scrubbed and been paid in coins to pass through. The city has a way of bringing people back into the same rooms to resolve, or at least reopen, what was left undone. There were nights I half expected the story to turn ugly. I had seen enough human cruelty to believe in the permanence of some injuries. But I had also seen the way learning reshapes a life. Bernardo thrived on the kind of focus that made tutors grin and colleagues take note. He accumulated skills, the way some people collect stamps, slowly, methodically, with an eye for detail. He completed medical school against a landscape that had more barriers than help. Residencies are grueling for anyone. They are a kind of marathon through other people's suffering. Yet Bernardo had an uncommon steadiness at the bedside. Patients felt seen by him because he was someone who had been seen in a life that could have easily eroded him. He brought to medicine not only knowledge, but a patience that smoothed frayed edges. There were graduations, modest and fierce. Community newspapers ran small notices of his honors. Old neighbors stopped him on the street, sometimes unsure whether to congratulate or to apologize. When he took his residency at the city's big public hospital, I felt a fierce mix of pride and the same fear that had always accompanied ambition. I had learned to walk both alongside him and a step behind, giving him the room to make mistakes and to learn. The months when he was a resident were long for both of us. He worked shifts that blurred into days. He slept little and ate where he could. But he called at odd hours to tell me about a diagnosis he'd made, about a test he'd read, and the excitement in his voice was like something new in the house. He spoke of neurology the way other people speak of poetry. He loved the way patterns unfolded in the brain and how small interventions could change a life. It was in that hospital, where fluorescent light and coffee fumes were constant companions, that the circle began to close in a way I would never have scripted. A man who once dismissed us stood on the other side of the triage desk with a pale face and the leash of a past he'd thought he'd discarded. He was admitted, and a team assembled. The day he was wheeled into the corridor that connected triage to the surgical suites, the air felt like it held its breath. I won't finish the rest of the scene now. I will save the arrival of certain people for what comes next. But I'll tell you this. When the boy who had once stacked wooden ducks became the professional who would walk into that room in his white coat, the world seemed in a small way corrected, not by spectacle, not by vengeance, but by a quiet, inevitable reversal that put care where contempt once stood. For years, I had told people that what looked like loss had become a kind of deliverance. I had avoided the language of triumph because I knew pain does not always make way for victory. Sometimes it only makes a witness. But there are moments when the arc of a life bends toward restoration, and in those moments you understand that dignity is not an accident. It is a work. When the hospital called to schedule follow-ups about Ricardo's case, when the paperwork listed a name and a specialty, and when the young doctor, so steady, so present, leaned across a counter and asked if I was all right, something in me rearranged. The years of rain and sleepless nights and $10 textbooks had not been erased. They had become the foundation under a person who, against low expectations, rose. There is a quiet redemption in that, but there is also a complexity I don't want to romanticize. People who leave do not always return. Systems that exclude do not always learn. The fact that someone can become a doctor is not a repudiation of all the other families who are still fighting for a seat at a table. My story is one path through a snarled forest. It is not a map for everyone. Still, that evening when Ricardo spoke, loud, cruel, careless, and when a doctor asked me, "Are you okay, Mom?" It was as if a book I'd been writing in fits and starts finally had a connective paragraph. It did not end old nights, nor did it wipe away the memory of rain. But it offered a proof that the work of raising a child, not to be fixed but to be accompanied, can bear fruit in shapes the world did not expect. There was, of course, much I had not yet told you. There were the long legal battles with school districts, the nights spent crying into a pillow after a cruel parent had whispered a judgment, the tutors who quit because the job was too hard, and the small, fierce teachers who stayed. There were also quiet joys, the way Bernardo would hum as he sutured a model in a simulation lab, the way he would come home and boil tea for me after a long shift because he knew I often forgot to drink it. And there were decisions ahead, residency options, specialty choices, negotiations with a hospital bureaucracy that can be as chilly as any man's indifference. There were people who would celebrate and people who would envy. There was a man whose words had once been weapons, and who now lay dependent on hands he had long ago closed his heart against. But those are parts of the story I will tell you next. For now, know this. The path we walked did not erase the sting of that question. It shifted what it meant, and in that shift I found a quiet, unshowy victory. I learned that dignity is not loud. It is the small, steady work of being present when the world wants you to be absent, of answering cruelty with competence, of letting care do the convincing that anger cannot. The corridor lights blinked as if impatient. Nurses passed with charts. A doctor cleared his throat and checked a monitor. Someone somewhere took a last sip of cold coffee. The city continued, indifferent and full. In the middle of it, I sat and breathed, and listened for the footsteps that would tell me whether the story would continue as I had hoped, or in the old patterns of mercy withheld. When they called my name to move through the side doors toward the ward, I stood. My hands were steady now, not because the past had been forgotten, but because it had become a part of the porch on which I stood. I stepped forward into the bright, anxious light, and the next chapter, unfolding complicated human, began to open. The doors toward the ward parted, and the air changed. The mechanical hum of vents, the soft beeping of monitors, the muted footfalls of people who are used to tending to other people's alarms. I followed the nurse who had called my name, my shoes whispering on the linoleum. My heart felt like an instrument tuned for an audience it had not expected, alert, ready. In the corridor, a gurney waited, and at its center lay the man who had once asked a question meant to erase us. Ricardo was pale, a shrunken version of the swagger I remembered. Tubes whispered, and a blanket had been tucked to his chin like an attempt at mercy. Someone spoke softly at his side. One of the residents, I think, laying out the notes and IV lines with a practiced calm. They introduced themselves to me with names I had learned only in parts of my life where people wear badges and speak in pages. There was no theater in their language. They simply moved to do their work. And then he stepped into the doorway. Dr. Bernardo. I didn't notice him at first because my mind still carried a photograph of the boy who had stacked wooden ducks, the child who once hummed as he pointed to the picture of the brain in an old book. But when I saw him, fully formed in his white coat, with a stethoscope tucked like a familiar thing against his chest and a hospital ID clipped just so, the air rearranged itself. He carried no triumph on his face. He moved with the careful steadiness of someone who had spent years learning both to listen and to weigh a life without haste. For a second, the room went quiet around the edges. In my chest, a dozen small alarms went off, old fears and new hopes in a tangle. He walked with the same quiet concentration he had when he studied late into the night, when his lamp burned down and he would call me and say, "Mum, I think I understand this now." Those late-night calls had the hushed zeal of prayer. Now here he was, and for a moment I watched him as if I was seeing music given shape. He approached Ricardo with a professional nod and spoke first to the team in clipped, efficient phrases. He reviewed charts, asked precise questions that coaxed out useful answers. He placed his palm lightly against Ricardo's forehead, checking temperature, tracing the pulse of a man whose past had ached us both. Then he turned to me and said, "Mrs. Pereira?" He used my name like he had learned it at school, a name earned in the long lessons of life, and his voice held a softness that stopped my breath. "Yes," I said. He looked at me, as if he had been taught, through his own hard history, to see not only the patient but the person who stood at the bedside. "I'm Dr. Bernardo," he said, and the name landed inside me like a small bell. "I'm overseeing his care. If you want to be in the room while we examine him, you're welcome to come." I wanted to walk away, to refuse to enter the scene the world had set like an exam, old humiliation pressed against my ribs. But the face of the man I had raised, calm, earnest, attentive, pulled me forward. I stepped closer. The staff pulled back with a professional courtesy, and he began to speak to Ricardo as a doctor should speak, clear, simple, respectful. I watched him work. He listened to the lungs, asked for reflex checks, deciphered the tangle of symptoms the way someone might read a difficult hand. He ordered tests and coordinated with imaging. He spoke with technicians and translated their words into a plan. He answered too many questions at once with a patience I had seen in him since childhood, the same insistence that there is value in explaining things thoroughly, because knowledge untied gently is not frightening. At one point, Ricardo's eyes opened, clouded and blinking. He looked at me first, and then his gaze found my son. There was a flicker of something like recognition, then confusion, and then, as if a script he'd rehearsed for years returned to him. He spoke too loud for the ward, and the old question climbed out of his throat, brittle as a bone left in the sun. "Where is your disabled son? Did he—" The rest of it broke like something that had been used up long before. Bernardo did not flinch. He stepped forward and responded the way he had been taught by mentors and hardened by the quiet gravity of medicine. He addressed Ricardo with clear professional warmth. "Mr. Costa, my name is Dr. Bernardo Pereira. I'm your neurologist. We're going to run some tests and make a plan. Try to stay calm. We'll do everything we can." Ricardo's lips moved like a man dredging up old weapons. For a strange beat, I felt the old sting of shame and embarrassment rise, as if to smother me. But then I watched my son with a new clarity. There was no blaze in his eyes meant to punish. There was a practiced and profound refusal to let the past shape the care he would provide in the present. He was not interested in making pain for the man who had caused our pain. He was interested in mitigating the unfolding of a disease. After the initial exam, Bernardo stepped aside and spoke softly to me. "Mom," he said simply. There was no flourish in it. The word carried the years between us. Late nights studying, small triumphs, and the long train of work that had brought us here. "There are a few things we need to do, but the team is with us. Why don't you get some rest, and I'll update you as soon as I can." He used the diminutive I had used with him when he was a boy, and it felt like an old song. My cheeks pricked with tears, but they were not the salt of humiliation. They were salt of many small things, relief and the memory of how we had learned to live. In those hours, the hospital became a place where the narrative I had been pushing forward for years was tested not in spectacle, but in the private machinery of care. The residents came and went, the tests processed in the hum of machines, and each report fed into Bernardo's calm, exacting mind. He reviewed scans with colleagues, argued cases with a humility that made everyone look at the facts rather than at old stories. He wrote orders with the same careful handwriting he'd kept all his life, neat, deliberate, legible. Neighbors and old acquaintances began to notice, of course. Word travels faster in the tight alleys of a life like ours. I would see someone glance at his badge and then nod, as if reassembling a memory with new evidence. People who had once whispered behind cupped hands now greeted him in the street, unsure whether to bow or to congratulate. It was awkward, and it was tender. I had never wanted applause for my child. I wanted him to have space to learn, to be safe, to be recognized for his efforts. If the neighborhood saw him now, I hoped they saw a person whose life had been constructed of choices and stubbornness rather than of miracles to display. Ricardo's condition stabilized and then shifted in ways doctors are used to describing with careful words. There were moments when he drifted in and out of coherence, when his apologies were slurred and incomplete. I watched him at his most vulnerable, a man relying on strangers to tend to what he had once been willing to abandon. There is a weight to watching someone who wounded you be in need. It tests the boundaries of what you owe to another human being. It asks whether anger or mercy is the truer teacher. The staff moved through their routines, nurses charted vitals, residents delivered updates, and the hospital's orchestration kept humming. Bernardo, though he carried the history between our family and Ricardo like a quiet stone, never allowed it to color the clinical judgment he had been trained to wield. He approached Ricardo with a diagnostic mind and a human heart. He explained findings clearly, discussed prognosis without false promises, and involved the family in plans when appropriate. When relatives argued, he mediated. When technicians worried aloud about the scarcity of beds and resources, he advocated with the steady insistence of someone who had learned that systems can be navigated with persistence. Ricardo, somewhere in those hours, slipped into a murmured apology. He said, "I didn't know," then stopped, as if the sentence had no life left. His voice was thin. I felt a surge of old anger that rose hot and immediate. I wanted to say words that would cut, to administer the same unkindness he'd given, but standing there with my son before me, watching him tend to the man who had once sent us into the rain, I realized I could not let that impulse shape me. For years, I'd believed that love was a force that insisted on forward motion. Now I saw that love can also be a quiet refusal to be consumed by what others do. It can be a decision to let healing be the witness. Bernardo's hands were steady as he adjusted medication and conferred with the team. He was not immune to the complexity of the situation, but he practiced a discipline that had become his profession, to meet the present needs of a patient without making the patient's past the reason for the care. There is a moral logic in that. To care for someone who hurt you is not surrender. It is an affirmation of the dignity we expect ourselves to honor in others. In the days that followed, Ricardo's recovery was slow and measured. The staff charted improvements. There were setbacks too. There were private conversations as well. Social workers knocking on our door to discuss family meetings, legal papers to be signed, and the complexities of discharge planning. Ricardo had relatives who visited sometimes, awkward and constrained. He had in him a capacity for regret that seemed to simmer beneath the surface. Sometimes he would reach for the telephone and fumble at numbers that led him to people who did not answer. Once, when he woke fully, his eyes found mine across a small crowd of white coats and beeping machines, and he said simply, "I was wrong." The simplest words can be both too much and not enough. He seemed to mean them with the bruised sincerity of a man whose pride had been broken and now needed to be rebuilt, if at all. He offered a form of apology that was at once tentative and sincere. I listened and did not reply with the barbed remarks I had once conjured in my mind. Instead, I said, "We are all cared for here, Mr. Costa." It was a polite distance and also an offering, clear boundaries wrapped in the civility that any ordinary human exchange deserves. There were other people in the ward who also carried stories, a mother who had lost a child, a young man with a fractured future, nurses who had seen so much they sometimes tilted their heads like people listening to far-off music. Bernardo treated them all with a generosity that felt carved from our shared history. Patients responded to him because he had learned through his own life how to be both fierce and tender. He could be exacting in the name of safety and gentle in the name of comfort. He would stop and talk to a small child about toys, would explain a diagnosis to an anxious father with metaphors that made clinical language accessible. He did not use his past as a license for anything other than the humility to understand what fear feels like. When Ricardo was discharged weeks later, it was into a reality he could not simply buy his way out of. Rehabilitation was recommended, follow-up appointments were arranged, the hospital social worker lined up community resources. He looked at me, and then at Bernardo, and there was a complexity in his gaze I could not fully pass. He said, "Thank you, doctor." And while the words were functional, their weight had changed. There was no grand conversion. There was no tearful reparation. There was only the small, honest act of recognition that a man who once had chosen distance now accepted help. After the discharge, life resumed its rhythms. I returned to my routines, to the small work that had kept food on our table, to the embrace of neighbors who had watched us climb. Bernardo continued his rounds, his residency now a history, and his practice a living thing. He took cases, taught younger residents, and offered his knowledge to those in need. He became known in the hospital as a doctor who listened twice as hard as he spoke. Patients recommended him to friends, and families trusted him because they had seen the way he tended to the whole person, their fears and facts together. We kept our gatherings small. Donna Jandira would drop by with soup, and we would sit around the table with cups that steamed and talk about the ridiculousness and grace of ordinary life. I would tell stories about Roberto and the radio he once fixed, and he would laugh, and Bernardo would squeeze my hand like a child saying grace over something modest but true. There were still hard nights, but they were not the same nights as before. They had the shape of challenges rather than the shape of annihilation. People we had known before began to approach differently. Some were awkward, unsure whether to say they were sorry or to pretend nothing had happened. Others were warmer, offering gestures that had once seemed impossible, an extra shift at work, assistance with transport, words of encouragement. There was no miraculous erasure of the past. Ricardo and I crossed paths in the market once, his cart half empty and mindful. He nodded, and I nodded back, and we walked different directions. There was no neat reconciliation, only the normalizing of a town where people carry histories and make new itineraries around them. In quiet moments, when the house was still and the lights dimmed, I would think of the arc of our lives. Roberto's steady hands, the night of rain, the long years of scrubbing and studying, the reluctant love that became real through endurance. I thought of Bernardo at his first residency graduation, wearing a gown that looked too much like a costume in the tiny church hall where they'd given him a certificate, his smile a mixture of victory and fatigue. Someone had said at that ceremony that life is a series of choices, small and large, made in the face of fear. I had loved the phrase because it named what we'd done. We had chosen, again and again, presence over retreat. I remember once sitting beside him after a particularly long shift. He had dark circles under his eyes, like the map of nights he'd traversed. He turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if—" And the question trailed into something that might have been grief or gratitude. I did not finish the sentence for him. There was no need. The silence between us had always been a language of its own. "Yes," I said finally, "every day. But we chose. Adin." He smiled in that tired, stubborn way, and I understood the truth of both the choosing and the being chosen. There were times when I visited the hospital not because of Ricardo, but because other patients needed us, or because a resident who had once been a tutor came to ask my advice about a child with Down syndrome who needed a champion at school. People sought me out, surprising me with their trust. It was a strange reversal to be on the receiving end of gratitude that I had once been desperate for. I had, in the doing of small things, the writing of letters, the ferrying of forms, the patient persistence at a principal's office, become a small resource for others. Through it all, I thought often about dignity and what it costs to keep it. There are many families still struggling with the kind of exclusions we faced. Systems are slow to change, and prejudice has long roots. I do not pretend our story is a template, yet I hold it up as a detail of what is possible, that a child labeled and underestimated can become a caregiver, that a mother who is cast into the rain can raise a hand that steadies another. The work is not to celebrate one success as if it erases the structural barriers other families still face. The work is to keep telling the truth about what it took: advocacy, resources, the stubborn refusal to accept a low bar. Faith lived in the small practices of our daily life. I will tell you plainly, I believed in God, and I believe God had a part in keeping us steady. But I do not believe you can trade a prayer for a guaranteed outcome. The truth is more complicated and much kinder. I believe God gives the courage to keep going. The rest is a labor of human hands, of people who open doors and walk through them with purpose. Years later, when Dr. Bernardo was no longer a resident but an attending neurologist with a panel of young trainees, he would sometimes stop by my place with small things: a loaf of bread, a magazine, a photo he had taken of a sunset. We would share a cup of tea and look out at the city as it softened at dusk. He would tell me about a case that had taught him patience or a family who had moved him. He was never showy about his achievements. The medals and certificates piled up quietly in a corner of his room like evidence rather than boasting. There was one conversation that I remember clearly, one that sealed what I had always hoped my life would teach him. We sat on a bench across from the hospital garden, and he watched a child play with a toy car, the kind you push with a hand. He said, "Mum, do you remember when you told me I could be anything?" I looked at him, surprised by the simple, honest softness in his voice. "You said you can be a person who makes a difference, even in small ways." I had told him that, though perhaps not in exactly those words. The phrase had been my liturgy for years. I had meant it as a practical command: get up, do the work, keep the light on. He replied, "I think it was the only thing I ever needed to hear." I did not expect applause for saying something that had seemed so ordinary, the steady insistence that what we do matters. But standing there watching him fold his hands around the handle of his coffee cup, I felt like an old woman who had given away everything she could and received back a life made of the same materials. The boy who once traced the brain in an old textbook had become a doctor who could read the body with compassion. The path had not eroded his humanness, it had deepened it. If there is a moral to the story, I would offer it bluntly. Dignity is not a gift that can be given by those who hold power. It is an insistence we earn and defend through presence, education, and the steady practice of care. It is also something we owe one another, even across the wounds that people have inflicted. I do not counsel forgetting or cheap reconciliation. I counsel the kind of courage that tends to others rightly, and that refuses to let another person's cruelty determine how you practice compassion. Sometimes people ask me, in the hushed way they ask when they do not know whether a wound will reopen, "Did you ever feel like getting revenge?" The question is always posed as if revenge is a tempting dessert on the table. The honest answer is, once or twice maybe, in the private chambers of hurt. But then I would look at Bernardo and the small catalogue of nights we'd kept, tiny notebooks full of appointments, receipts, the scrawl of tutoring notes, and I would choose care. Not because revenge is unthinkable, but because the energy it would take to pursue vindication is energy that could be spent healing. I had spent my life building a different muscle, one for endurance and another for steady love. Ricardo's presence in our lives dimmed over time, as is natural in human affairs. He resurfaced now and then, a call, a letter, a medical record that needed clarifying, and each time it asked the same question: what do we make of those who once turned their backs? I learned to answer with boundaries and with a grace that did not lay down my self-respect. If he sought forgiveness, that was his labor to carry. If he needed care, I would not be the one to deny it when it was in reach. But I also made sure that compassion did not become a door left wide open for further harm. The community, too, learned in small increments. Schools that had once refused to include Bernardo adapted curriculums. Other parents began to ask questions rather than make assumptions. District funding shifted slowly as advocates, some parents, some teachers, took up the banner for inclusion. It was not a revolution. It was a steady collection of small changes that, like the stitches in a well-mended shirt, held the fabric better against wear. I think often about mothers I have met along the way, women whose sacrifices are not applauded in stories, but who keep a child's world spinning. I want to tell them gently but fiercely that your work matters. Fight for the seat at the table, advocate for the plan, push for accommodations, keep the small records, take the notes, find the people who will say yes. Be stubborn in the right ways, and remember to rest when you can. One afternoon, when the sky was the color of old coins, I found myself in the hospital cafeteria with a woman I had once argued with at a meeting about an inclusion plan. She had been skeptical, a voice of cautious realism. We talked then, not as adversaries, but as two people who had both been through hard seasons. She said, "I didn't understand," simply. I remember answering, "Neither did I," before it became mine. Tut! Her hand reached across the small table and squeezed mine like a truce. I am not a prophet. I did not intend to teach a sermon about how pain becomes blessing. But I have learned by living and by the work of others that sometimes the things we think break us are the very things that teach us how to build. We learned to build on what we had: a meager wage, a neighbor's kindness, a child's fascination with paragraphs. We learn to ask for help and to accept it. We learn to name our needs clearly so other people could help meet them. In the end, the question asked in the hospital lobby, "Where is your disabled son? Did he die?" was transformed not by spectacle, but by the daily practice of living. It became, for me, a line that marked how far we'd come, rather than a scar that defined us. The man who had hurled it did not receive his comeuppance in a dramatic courtroom scene or a public shaming. He received something quieter, care at a bedside from the person he had scorned. For me, that was the truest kind of victory, the kind that did not seek to humiliate, but to restore the basic humanity of everyone involved, even the one who had been cruel. I've told you a lot about the outside, tests and exams, residencies and hospital corridors, but not enough about the interior geography of hope. Hope for me was often a series of tiny gestures. The tutor who stayed an extra hour, the teacher who adjusted a lesson, the neighbor who offered babysitting without making a fuss. All of those small interventions aggregated into a life that could aim higher than mere survival. If you are a parent out there carrying a child who is met with lowered expectations, or if you are someone who has been humiliated and thinks the world has no recourse, know this: the work you do each day is part of a ledger that counts. It may not produce the same story for every family. The world is capricious and systems are stubborn. But the commitment to presence, to education, and to advocacy changes the arc not only of one life, but of the communities around it. There is one last small thing I want to tell you. Years after the hospital episode, on a day when school had just let out and the neighborhood hummed with the sound of kids and the distant buzz of scooters, Bernardo walked with me down the street to buy flour. He reached over and kissed my forehead lightly, in the way he had always done as a child when offering thanks. People glanced and smiled. A woman I had once argued with about resource allocation waved. It was a small, ordinary scene, a domesticity that had been hard-won. As we stood in line at the bakery, I glanced at him and said, "You did well, son." He looked back at me with a modest pride and answered, "So did you, Mom. So did you." There are many days I relive the bench in the bus shelter, the cold rain, the nights of scraping together change. Those memories are part of me. They taught me not only how to survive, but how to invest in a future that might not follow the neat scripts other people imagine. They taught me the value of dignity and the ethics of caring well. If this story has encouraged you, please share it with someone who may need hope, and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience and quiet victories. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. There is something profound in knowing that these small testimonies travel and touch others. If you are walking through hard times, remember, dignity is a work. Keep showing up. There is no neat epilogue where every wound is healed and every wrong is made right. Life keeps banked fires of grief among the warm embers of the good. But if you ask me what I carry now, I would say this: a steadier heart, a belief in the slow power of care, and the knowledge that sometimes the hardest mornings make room for a gentler afternoon. We are not defined by one cruel voice in a lobby. We are defined by the lives we build in the margins, by the small, stubborn acts of love that, over time, rearrange the world.